to avoid endless German recidivism, these authors argued, was by partitioning the country into principalities and supervising the education of their populations until the idea of Germany had been rooted out. Eventually, this school of thought crossed the Atlantic, where its ideas morphed into the Morgenthau Plan, which proposed that Germany should be deindustrialized and then live forever under international supervision as an agricultural country. In 1945, it had yet to dawn on the leaders or publics of the Allied countries that these proposals were not remotely realistic. But even if they had been achievable solutions to the so-called German problem, Lasky contended that they relied upon a false premise, that Germany was the country of Hitler fanatics, presented to the world by Nazi propaganda. In his diary, Lasky was rightly skeptical about the werewolves, the phantom resistance that Goebbels' propaganda had promised would continue the fight for the Third Reich. He was also increasingly apoplectic about the stupidity of the non-fraternization policy, which he believed would only alienate and radicalize Germans against their occupiers. Whenever he had the opportunity, Lasky met and spoke to Germans, from lowly provincial folk to intellectuals like Karl Jaspers and his wife, to whom he would deliver books sent from the United States by Hannah Arendt. Some of these conversations, such as the following chance encounter with an old man who led him to the ruins of Goethe's house in Frankfurt, appear to have profoundly influenced his thinking. No, he insisted, not all of the German people. Believe me, only a small part of the German people supported Hitler. We were not blind to the evil, and to that most evil of all the Nazi inhumanities, the murder of the Jews. But Hitler was all-powerful. The youth was at his disposal, and he taught them, gave them faith, made them fanatics. How could they know better when they had never been taught to think or to doubt? I stood with him on the rubble heap and offered quiet dissents, challenges, promptings. He spoke earnestly and with dignity, and more with a passion which moved me greatly. Here was a German, a citizen of the Third Reich, who understood the tragedy, who knew the betrayals and the deceit. There are paths before us. We don't have many choices now. We've had so few for so long, but we cannot afford to go wrong. Our land and our people have made only enemies. Now we have an opportunity to make friends, friends of a new, free Germany. His face and voice were grave and sincere, and he held his hand out to me a little uncertainly and tentatively. I grasped it, shook it, and said goodbye. He carried his bicycle off to the makeshift path and rode away. I stumbled over the bricks back to the jeep. The horn had been honking, and everybody was impatient to leave. You don't believe all that stuff, do you? I suppose he's sorry. They're all sorry now. You know, those are Nazi orders. Fraternize and propagandize. I refused to be drawn into the argument. When can one begin to believe again? Who is so strong as to deny all hope, and so coldly omniscient as not to have a need to trust? Will there never be an end to deceit and suspicion? I could decide to doubt or to believe. I would believe. He was in earnest. Let this be a beginning. For Lasky, the best defense against German revanchism was to revive democratic culture in Germany, to re-establish a free press with a spirit of free criticism, assist in the publication of German books by German authors, rebuild libraries, re-establish theatres and orchestras, and foster hope among Germans that their country had some kind of civilized future. In other words, he did not want the Allies to repeat the mistakes of the 1920s by trying to punish Germany out of existence. The German problem, as Lasky saw it, was no longer Nazism, but that no one thinks of their life anymore, what it means, what it should add up to. The pride in living, the dignity of believing in something, that's part of the ruins too. In 1945, Lasky had no faith that the Americans would do any of the sensible things he advocated. As he noted at one point in the diary, in reference to his superiors, problem of creating a democratic public opinion with a German press, question of making new loyalties and confidence, overlooked completely. Lasky's trenchant criticisms of the American occupation might surprise those who have only read about him in Francis Stonner Saunders's overrated volume, Who Paid the Piper?, the most famous history of the cultural Cold War. In that work, Lasky is presented as a sinister CIA stooge who fooled European intellectuals into collaborating in anti-communist propaganda on behalf of the US authorities through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, the organization he played a key role in founding in 1950. But as Sidni Huc once wrote, His detractors to the contrary, notwithstanding, Melvin Lasky has never been an apologist for American domestic or foreign policy. He has exercised his privilege as a citizen of a free culture to criticize his own country's shortcomings, particularly in defense of freedom. The real story can be found in works of reportage like William Byford Jones's Berlin Twilight, 1947, or Norbert Meulen's The Return of Germany, 1953, or in the contemporary journalism of The New Leader, Politics, or Partisan Review, some of it written by Lasky himself, or in Richard Lowenthal and Willy Brandt's biography of Ernst Reuter, or in Norman Naimark's historical work, The Russians in Germany. Until the autumn of 1947, the Western powers were pathetically indulgent towards the Soviet authorities in Germany, while the American military government, OMGUS, OMGUS, was hopelessly ignorant about communist infiltration in its administrative apparatus. Far from being a CIA stooge, Lasky was a persuasive critic of post-war US policy and a significant factor in changing it. He realized that the Cold War had started a long time before US policymakers, and in late 1947, he was able to convince General Clay of the need for a cultural magazine free from the influence or censorship of the Soviets. In his diary, we can already see it dawning on Lasky that the Soviets had moved to take control of German culture. In Berlin, one of their first moves was to seize the airwaves, where the anti-Western propaganda campaign began immediately. What was Radio Berlin saying? Well, I hadn't heard it, but the summaries I got were exceedingly interesting. A full, rich, organized propaganda campaign to win over the German people for communism. The people were to be treated well. The ration was to be the biggest available. Cultural programs were beginning, music, opera, lectures. The propaganda was, of course, attended by a campaign of political terror. Buchenwald was reopened. From a conversation with some Russian soldiers, Lasky heard an anecdote about a German engineer arrested by SS for having married and raised a Russian family. Now, wife and children arrested by NKVD for German father and husband. In the Soviet zone, the emergence of a non-communist press was also quickly stamped out. The Neue Zeit, which had been so popular and resourceful some months ago, was a small sheet now and almost lifeless. Its large format, I learn, was suddenly and arbitrarily reduced. The editor, a Christian Democrat, is under regular fire from the Communist Party and Red Army newspapers. The staff members complain of the harshness of Soviet censors, and the claim was that as much as 35 to 40% of the editorial content is sometimes removed. There has been little opportunity to publish news of Western orientation, and the editors have been increasingly forced to publish in prominent places material supplied by the Soviets. Soviet propaganda had been the most strident herald of the Destroy Germany chorus during the war, and Stalin's most notorious propagandist, Ilya Ehrenburg, had instructed his readers to kill Germans wherever they found them. It is also likely that the Soviets were influencing the US's wartime German policy. Harry Dexter White, a US State Department official and the guiding spirit of the Morgenthau Plan, was almost certainly a concealed communist and Soviet spy. In Lasky's view, it suited Stalin that the Western powers were hostile towards Germany and deeply skeptical about its democratic potential. It meant that they behaved more like dictatorial conquerors than liberators. In an article Lasky wrote for The New Leader in 1946, he noted that the Americans had built a grand shopping mall in Frankfurt for the sole use of American GIs, and he accused them of creating a bustling little barbed wire community amid German misery. This, along with the widespread impression that the Western powers could not be relied upon to resist the Sovietization of Germany, made it easier for communist propaganda to spread its familiar cocktail of disaffection, cynicism, and fear, which paid such dividends in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. The denazification policy, which was fully justifiable insofar as it was aimed at purging Nazi leaders and genuine fanatics, was also a boon to the Soviet authorities. With American approval, they used it to veto the appointment of Social Democrat Ernst Reuter after he was elected mayor of the jointly administered city of Berlin in 1947, on the basis that he was an anti-communist and therefore a fascist. This was only the most obvious example of what was going on in both the Soviet and American zones, where communists were using denazification as a weapon against anti-totalitarians. Franz Borkenau captured the German atmosphere in an article for Tablet in 1947. The average German does not want to fall foul of the housing office or to have his denazification dossier scrutinized closely by a communist, but most of all, he does not want to complain about this communist infiltration because, exactly as in Nazi times, the man to whom he opened his heart might be a Gestapo agent, so now the recipient of his complaint might himself be a communist. All Germans have seen the rise of one totalitarian dictatorship. Now they ask, is the international peace so safe that we need not fear to be overrun by Soviet armies in, let us say, 10 or 15 years from today? Will not then every outspoken word we said about the communists now mean certain death? Almost more offensive to Lasky than the democracy's appeasement of the Soviets was the clumsiness of denazification with respect to culture. In his Partisan Review article on the state of German culture, Lasky provided the example of Ernst Jünger, who was still blacklisted for his early Nazi sympathies, despite having written an anti-Nazi parable at obvious personal risk as early as 1939. Was there really any reason to deprive Germans of the right to read his work and form their own judgments, or to deprive German journalists of the right to discuss and criticize it freely in literary reviews? After Richard Strauss's masterpiece, Metamorphosen, a composition that mourned the destruction of German culture by the Nazis, premiered in Zurich in 1946, its composer was welcomed to London the following year as a guest of Sir Thomas Beecham. But Strauss's work was verboten in Germany. For Lasky, the most concerning thing about prohibitions like these was the implied abnegation of cultural freedom. In a way, the actual political views of Jünger were immaterial. What mattered to Lasky was that democratic countries were exhibiting a lack of faith in their own principles. Stalinism was being given the half-light it needs to have its own way, he wrote, as all sides accepted the supreme right of the state in matters of art and culture. Contrary to the portrait of a U.S. Mandarin painted by Stonner Saunders in her book about the CCF, Lasky founded Der Monat to liberate German culture from the prohibitions of the state, and it was one of the first German publications to be free of the censorious practice of occupation licensing. He accomplished this at a time when the democracies lacked conviction and the Soviet Union was passionately intent on totalitarianizing Germany. In 1945, he had already grasped that the Soviet cultural offensive was the main issue. In a letter to Arendt, appropriately included among his diary entries by its editor, Charlotte Lerg, he hinted at this. There isn't much more to add, except to say that I overlook the largest issue, politics and the intelligentsia, until another time. The Russian question is, of course, central to it. Along with Ernst Reuter and one or two others, Lasky deserves to be remembered as an indefatigable defender of the liberal spirit, who helped a free Germany arise from the darkness. He was never forgiven for it by the GDR's propagandists, but he lived long enough to celebrate the collapse of their police state. Melvin, du hast gewonnen, you have won, exclaimed a 1991 headline in the German weekly Die Zeit, and to write its epitaph. A review of The Diary of Lieutenant Melvin J. Lasky, Into Germany at the End of World War II, by Charlotte A. Lerg, editor. 342 pages, Berg Hahn Books, August 2024. Written by Oscar Clark. Read by Iona Italia.